Are we? It's on. Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to the Humanities Center for the 7th session in our series on the mountain. I would have said that this was the penultimate session, but we've added a 9th session because you just can't get enough of it. And this is going to be something that will be a lovely culmination to the series, I think. So, and there were some of these flying around here. On Tuesday, November the 11th, at our usual time, 4 o'clock, we'll be screening Jennifer Peedham's remarkable documentary, Mountain. It's a gorgeous piece of work and is a glorious piece of filmmaking, which would be a nice way to end the series. I heartily invite you all to attend. Fittingly, that will be the session that picks up themes from next week's panel, in which Roger Pace and Eric Pearson discuss the mountain in film and documentary. So after that one, the following week, we'll show that documentary. But turning to today, we have the pleasure of listening to 3 distinguished members of the Department of Biology who will be talking with us about life at high altitude. So Curtis Loer received his PhD from UC San Diego and has been a member of the faculty here since 1997 as the Fletcher Jones Chair in Biology. I'm warned that this may be out of date, this material, but his teaching and research interests are in cell molecular biology, particularly in the development and function of the nervous system. His lab works with a popular model organism, the 1,000-cell roundworm C. elegans, using molecular genetics to understand how genes function to regulate and pattern its simple nervous system. Dr. Loer is particularly interested in nerve cells that make and use the neurotransmitter serotonin and how these cells regulate behavior in C. elegans and related free-living nematodes. Sue Lowery is professor and chair in the Department of Biology. She received her PhD in marine biology from UCSD's Scripps Institution of Oceanography. She's been a recipient of the National Science Foundation pre-doctoral fellowship and a National Research Council post-doctoral fellowship. Dr. Lowery's particular research interests lie in the effect of endurance swimming on the development of muscle in juvenile marine fishes. She is a member of Project Kaleidoscope's faculty for the 21st century, working on the national level for science education reform. She's also a past recipient of USD's Davies Award for Excellence in Teaching. And Michael Mayer joined the USD faculty in 1994 and is professor of biology. He received his PhD in botany from Washington State University, and his research focuses on plant systematics. This focus on plant diversity involves deciphering the evolutionary relationships among plants and then using these patterns to infer the processes by which plants evolve, speciate, and produce new lineages. Dr. Mayer has collaborated with researchers at San Diego State University and the Natural History Museum in Balboa Park. His research has included work on the cholla cactus of the Anza Borrego Desert. Like Dr. Lowery, he has been a regular and a cherished contributor to the Natural Landscapes series. I'll say it again, it is always a delight to have our friends from the natural sciences speak at the Humanities Center. So please give a very warm welcome to Professors Loer, Lowery, and Mayer.
Well, it's a delight to be here again. And I think I'm going to start with a little mood music.
Edelweiss, every morning you greet me.
That's not Edelweiss.
All and white, clean and bright, you look happy to meet me.
Well, I felt if Jeff Malecki can play some cheesy music in his presentation, then I would go ahead and do so too. Thanks to Brian and the Humanities Center for having me back yet again, third time, and I think I did it. I think I'll never be invited back again now. That's going to take care of it. Today, talking about plant life at high elevations. And I play the Edelweiss song because Edelweiss is sort of an iconic flower of the European alpine. And indeed, I'm thinking about the alpine today because on mountains we have characteristic zonation of plants. And, you know, we move from, at lower elevations, hardwood forests, into conifer forests, and then into a tundra-type vegetation, and up to snow and ice. Well, we've covered forest already, right, a year ago. So we kind of done forest for this series. And so my focus will be the high elevation in mountains, the alpine area. You can see the zonation here, the conifer forest reaching up to a place where there's a pretty distinct break. And then there's some green here, which is low-lying types of plants, and then moving up elevation to the snow-capped peaks. This zonation is repeated around the world, and in fact, the zonation that we see in mountains with regard to elevation, it echoes the zonation we see as we move from the equator to the poles. And in fact, we use the same terminology for the coniferous forest or taiga, for the tundra or grassland. Tundra is Russian for treeless plain. We use the word tundra at the high elevations in mountains as well. And then the snow-capped peak, of course, mimicking the polar ice range to the extent of the end of the living range of plants. So these terms are the nival zone, which actually has to do with snow or snowy, okay? The alpine zone and subalpine zone, conifer forest, montane zone, right? Today we're going to be thinking about tree line and above, the alpine zone. And in fact, a place like Norway has both Arctic and alpine zonation due to its location in the latitude. And we see the same terminology in the nival zone, the snow line here, the tree line here. I point this out because Norway is one of the places in which you've got coastal tundra and montane tundra. And it shows a tree line that's actually much more lower near the coast than it is inland. Tree line is a lot higher. Trees can grow higher up in the interior of a continent. And I like this contrast because we could do the same thing in the United States. Folks in Maine can take a nice little summer's walk up to 5,200 feet, Mount Katahdin in Maine, and reach tundra, right? Whereas to reach tundra in the Southern Sierra, you need to get up to about 11,000 feet. And that has everything to do with the fact that life on the coast is a lot more stormy. There's a lot more precipitation. There's a lot fewer growing days. It stays colder into the summer, depressing the length of time for growth. And so in a place like the Southern Sierra, a lot less snow, a lot more sun, outside of stormy weather. So the trees can grow a lot higher up in altitude because there's more time to grow. And it seems to be that the determining factor of where tree line is sort of the minimum available time to actually grow woody tissue. So conifers are the more sturdy of the trees. They make it the highest, but there's a certain point where they just cannot mature woody tissue. And at that point, they are excluded, leaving then the scene to the wildflowers, low-growing plants. These plants, of course, now without competition by shrubs and trees, dominate the scene. And here's a lovely little assemblage of Northern Hemisphere alpine wildflowers. But of course, the Northern Hemisphere isn't the only place where alpine comes from. Of course, we call the zone alpine just because it was best characterized and first characterized in Europe, in the Alps mountains, Alpines. But we have high elevation mountains throughout the world. Of course, there's the Andes, and then there's the west coast of the United States, that whole ridge, the backbone going all the way down. We've got alpine right on the equator. I think Curtis might be talking a little bit about that, a little bit of experience there. And we've got alpine, of course, in the Himalayas, and then there is in, of course, Europe and Norway, and in other places as well, including New Zealand. I'll look at a few of those slides as we move along. So let's think about what it takes to be an alpine plant. You got to survive a few different things. By the way, Sky Pilot, this is from the Southern Sierra Nevada. Mark, did you run into that in your hike up there? Or you might be too focused breathing. All right, of course, low temperatures. As you increase altitude, you decrease the mean temperature. Intense solar radiation. There is less atmosphere to filter out the sun's rays, and that includes high normal spectrum and high UV light as well. Of course, high wind exposure. There are many places to hide from the wind. Dry, thin, poorly developed soil. There's a lot of erosion ongoing, and soil takes a while to develop with all sorts of small particles, organic material, nutrients and such that enrich, make a good soil. Well, that ain't going to happen mostly up in the alpine, except in meadows. Short growing season. So, of course, with a snowpack that is reluctant to melt and for freezing to start back up again in the autumn, you sometimes have a growing season that's 6 to 8 weeks in the alpine. So what do plants do to cope with this? Well, low growth, and sometimes low height is forced by the environment, in which you've got the pressure of snow or of relentless wind that's bending and shaping and stunting the growth of many woody plants, particularly right at tree line. Okay? This leads to what we call krummholz, which means crooked wood. And this is a kind of form that you see even on windy bluffs along the ocean, right? High elevations all over the world, you find krummholz growth form. And this, I love this, a white-barked pine tree. This is more of a carpet here, and that's a krummholz form. Sometimes low growth is adapted by the herbaceous plants. They are growing low to get out of the wind. They're also growing low to actually duck and hide under the snow. More on that in a moment. This cushion growth form allows then the plant to be compact, actually to shelter young growth from within, and again, to minimize its exposure to wind. So we call them cushion plants. Leaves are often hairy and succulent. Hairy to kind of insulate from the wind, or actually insulate from the sun. Succulent to hold on to water. Light-colored to reflect sunlight. Evergreen because with the short growing season, as I said, plants have to invest too much and they have to grow too quickly to produce leaves every growing season. So if they can be perennial, if they can have leaves that last more than one season, that's better. Perennial lifespan. So yes, likewise, you can't complete your whole lifespan within 6 to 8 weeks from seed to seed. So think about a young tender shoot getting going right when there's bare ground or right when there's enough water and enough heat for them to get started, and then growing through all of that to finish out their life cycle at the end of that short growing season. Another thing they do is have most of their biomass underground. If they're going to live from year to year, it's a good way to hedge their bets as well, storing nutrients in roots and thickened stems and other structures that lie below the ground. So yes, and more than other plants, 60 to 80% of their biomass might be underground. And again, snow is an insulation. Snow will keep them less cold over the winter, having a nice blanket over them. So they grow low enough to stay under that snowpack. Oh, and then just a couple little shout outs. The highest flowering plant that has been found that I could find is a buttercup at 20,000 feet on the Himalayan mountain. I don't know which one. But by the way, I think I'm going to show both meters and feet. But, you know, I think feet sound so much more impressive when you're talking about elevation. Don't you agree? I think. All right. And then, of course, when flowering plants have lost their ability to cope with the environment, there's always going to be some mosses and lichens that can get a little bit higher up into the rocks and glacier cracks and such like that in the nival zone. Okay, and let's look at a couple other of these locations that I'm talking about. New Zealand, they have some compressed zones as well because they don't get too far from the ocean being on an island, but have lovely members of families that we know, but species that we don't know. So here's something like from the buttercup family as well. This one is an amazing plant that has most curious stunted compound leaves. This is in the carrot family or parsley family, and it's a pretty cool species that's endemic to New Zealand. And I don't have time to do a whole little, I think I'd probably put you to sleep too, even though you like pretty pictures. But I'm just going to do it quick. Chilean Andes. They're alpine, gorgeous as well. The form is similar. You get plopped into some of these locations in the world you might not know actually where you are, just by looking at the vegetation. The Himalayas, again, they have a lot more similarity with the European alpine simply because it's all part of Eurasia, and there's been a lot of transfer back and forth, and similar groups, even similar species in some cases. But then there's the African alpine, which is typical in some ways, but then there are a few oddities, including these dendrosenecio, which I could go out and find you a senecio right now. Senecio is a very large genus, but it grows as a weed around here. I could pluck a little weed. That's a senecio. The flowers would look very similar to this sucker here. But this is a giant lobelia. A lobelia is a nice, soft little garden plant. This grows large and bulky. And again, it's something like 14,000 feet elevation. How do they do it? Well, there's no real snowpack here. Since we're near the equator, there is freezing, but there's a growing season that goes around the year. But it freezes every night. Lobelia has a really cool apparatus in which they collect water at the base of the leaves, which freeze every night. And that frozen water provides actually insulation for the interior from there. So without that water being frozen, that little insulating layer would allow then the interior would freeze and they would damage the plant. Anyway, they cope just fine. Okay, so I know people are nodding off, so let's talk about sex. That'll do it. Okay? So, very quickly, plant sex requires pollination. And when you see a showy flower, it's not for anything. It's not for us. It's for sex. It's for the pollinator to entice them. Okay? So there is a shooting star. This is from California here, actually from Colorado as well. They're all over the western states. Showy flowers indicate animal pollination. And is pollination affected by high altitude? If you're going to live at high altitude, that means these showy plants have to have their pollinators nearby, right? Well, sure, we have a temperature, which is an issue. Plants can survive, but what about the animals? The majority of pollination in the alpine is done by birds and bees, flies, moths, and butterflies. And most can commute from lower elevations. So they just come up slope and from where they're more comfortable and do their pollination. Of course, it's a fee for service. This is a mutualism for the most part. They get up there to get pollen and to get nectar. But there is limits to these pollinators. Birds tend to be more effective pollinators near the equator in the subtropics at high elevation. Then they start to drop off. When you get to the mid-latitudes, you've got a lot of hummingbirds still active, but then they taper off as well, going beyond that. Bees, very reliable and diverse group. This is not just honeybees, folks. These are hundreds of species of bees that act as pollinators. Bees work really well, except they don't work when it's below 10 degrees centigrade, right, or 50 degrees Celsius. They need a certain amount of warmth. They tend to actually drop out at above 4,000 meters in the Himalayas, 12,000 feet. So leaving then flies. Flies tend to be the highest pollinators in terms of altitude. They do a great job, and a lot of flowers have adapted to fly pollination. I should point out with bees as well. In New Zealand, the alpine at the highest elevation sort of lacks the type of flowers that we expect bees to appreciate. Bees like cup-shaped flowers. They like short tubes. They like the colors bright yellow, blue, and purple. These are all classic bee-type flowers. Well, you get up to high elevation in New Zealand, and it's a lot of white and pale yellow. And it's because there are no long-tongued bees in New Zealand. That group just doesn't exist there. And I'm glad that Jeff Morse isn't here to correct me. That's my story, and I'm sticking with it. Okay. So what do plants do in terms of pollination? Well, a lot of alpine wildflowers are adjusted to where they can accommodate bees or flies. So they are generalists in pollinator preference. They produce large flowers that can be seen at greater distances. This is pretty cool. A lot of things that people say about wildflowers in the alpine is that they are disproportionately large compared to their vegetative body. They spend a lot on those flowers. So they can be seen at greater distances. They bloom as soon as they can, even before the snow melts. Now they can resort to wind pollination. Wind pollination is an option, but these woody plants like conifers and willows are famous for relying on wind pollination, but they're limited by tree line. Grasses can use wind pollination and do use wind pollination virtually exclusively, but to use wind pollination effectively, you have to live in a dense colony. A meadow is fine, but scattered among the rocks, it's not the most efficient type of pollination. Self-pollination is a good backup plan. If you don't get serviced by an insect or a bird, then ultimately you can self-pollinate and still have some seed for the next season. Not great for maximizing genetic diversity of an organism or within a population, though. Asexual reproduction, okay, when it all comes down to it, do you want to give up on sex, or at least have the really another backup plan is simply use rhizomes and make a clump, clone yourself vegetatively, and persist in that location that way. Okay, now I mentioned Edelweiss. This icon, this emblem of the alpine in Europe. Can anybody recognize Edelweiss? Where is Edelweiss? Don't pull out your phones. Don't cheat. I want, does anyone know where Edelweiss is on that lineup? Remember the clues. The clues are small and white, clean and bright. Okay? Works a little bit. I don't know. Anyone got? I got. Okay. Anyone give it a try? Come on. I got an Alpine milk chocolate bar for the one who gets it. Milk chocolate. Sorry. He won't even play. Come on, Ron.
Is it the top right? No.
The top right? Really? Catherine, you did it. Okay. And you know, so there it is. Not a real good picture of it. But then again, there it is there. It's, and I have to say, I heard the song before I saw the flower. And when I saw the flower, I thought, really? Okay, so maybe I'm a floral elitist, but...
Oh, you are.
It's a little homely, don't you think? So, Edelweiss, Leontopodium nivale. This is a species that also goes by the name of cat's paws and wallflower. And it grows up around 12,000 feet below and above in the Alps. And yeah, so you may love the way it looks, but if you're also a botanist, you will not be able to resist being obnoxious and saying, yeah, but it's not a flower, right? It's not a flower. Let's look at it up close, folks. Gory close-up here. First of all, those white things that look like petals, they're not petals, they're leaves. Okay? Those are leaves. They're covered with white fur. Somebody scratched it off over here, showing you the leaf underneath. And this stuff in the middle, well, what you have here is 8 right now, 8 what we call heads. This is a member of the sunflower family. Sunflowers that have the gigantic heads, well, you may not know that that's not a flower either. That is a composite of flowers. It's a false flower. It's a whole inflorescence mimicking a single flower to try to draw in pollinators. So this is a head that consists of dozens of flowers. So the whole branch here is what we've got, has hundreds of flowers. This thing here in the middle is one of these heads that's already finished flowering. And it looks like there's others that will take the place of these others. So these guys can continue blooming for a while with hundreds of these little flowers, a pretty clever way to live. It's pretty small, too. One of those heads is half a centimeter. And so there is the Edelweiss flower. It's small, but it ain't white, okay? Clean and bright? Well, that's a subjective type of judgment there. So that's Edelweiss, okay? You got to give it cred for surviving up there. And let's talk about the story. Why is it so revered? So, goes back, actually, to the mid-1800s. Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria, his Empress Elizabeth. Here they are in their 25th wedding anniversary. I'm going to follow on Mark again. Mark mentioned the Alpinist movement in the 1800s, the romance of the high elevation. These two were taking a walk, 1856, taking a hike, actually. And the emperor got all wound up and wanted to climb up higher and grab a little twig of Edelweiss, brought it down and presented it to his wife as a token of love. And since then, it's taken on a life of its own. The populace of Austria embraced this emblem. It became a symbol of tenacity for living up in the rocks at the highest elevation, a symbol of purity. Edelweiss means noble white, okay? A symbol of strength and courage and love, and all those things. And so since then, it became so broadly revered that by 1886, it is, presumably, if I can trust the internet, it is the very first plant that's ever been protected by a government. Okay, 1886, it was already being over-collected by the enthusiastic alpinists who wanted to go show their bravery by clinging to rocks and trying to get a little sprig of this plant. So, it's a fun little story. It is now actually the, I have this written down here, I think I can remember it. It is a national symbol of Bulgaria, of Austria, of Switzerland, of Italy. Virtually every country that touches the Alps revere Edelweiss. Let's see who else we got. Slovenia. Left out Slovenia. Okay. Well, okay. One more thing about this is that it is part of a larger group. In fact, it used to be, instead of Leontopodium, it used to be in the genus Nephalium, which has a similar kind of floral structure. There's no ray flowers or sort of petals around the periphery. There's these very dense little heads. This one, I could run outside and bring one back in about 1 minute. It's right over in the Kumei garden, okay, growing there. Not so fuzzy. But this one here, look at the hairs on this one. Look at the hairs on Palustri here. This one grows in the desert. Hey, here's our connection between the high alpine and the desert. So adaptations that help reduce sunlight damage and water loss in the desert help in the alpine. We know that, that Edelweiss came from Central Asia after the last ice age and worked its way up. It's a survivor and it's tenacious, that's for sure. Part of a large group of survivors like that. Oops. And I guess in closing, I just leave you with this quote that in nature nothing is perfect and everything is perfect. Right? Trees can be contorted, bent in weird ways, and they're still beautiful. Alice Walker. And I would say also that homely as it might be, it's an object of amazing design. Thank you very much.
Hello, I'm going to talk about humans in the mountains, and I did not bring chocolate, but I do have pictures of cute babies, so maybe that'll work. So today I'm going to be talking more about the long-term living in the mountains and leave the short-term visits to the mountain to Curtis. So if we look across the globe, humans currently reside in 4 high-altitude areas, and so those are areas that are over 2,500 meters, or 8,250 feet. If we go into the oldest, potentially, area, these would be the Ethiopian highlands, and currently there's 25 million residents at this altitude. There's a lot of controversy over how long permanent settlements might have been at these elevations, and you can see that the ranges are pretty wide. So we'll skip right over to the Tibetans. And in the Himalayan plateau, we currently have 78 million people living at this altitude, and settlements there include peoples that have lived there for over 30,000 years. In the Andes, in the Altiplano, we have 36 million residents, and we know that settlements have been there and people living continuously for at least 14,000 years. And in the North America, we see that we currently have some settlements at this level, but we don't really have any permanent settlements that have a long history. Indigenous were using some of these areas seasonally, but not living there full time. And so most of these settlements are pretty recent, and they're mostly Europeans who have come from the lowlands and are living there. And then you might notice that there's an absence of any populations in where all of our literature and most of our other things have been set, which would be in the Alps. So if you look at the distribution of these high-altitude people, we see that all 4 continents are represented if you're down around 2,500 to 3,000 meters. But as you go higher, we see that we lose the populations in Ethiopia or Africa and in North America, and you get dominance by the Andeans and the Tibetans. And then only the Tibetans or the Asians are living above 5,000 meters. Now, why are we restricted? So unlike the plants, Mike didn't mention oxygen at all, because of course they make their own. But for animals, oxygen is a huge problem. And if we start off with what the oxygen is like in San Diego for our sea level oxygen, we would see as you go up in elevation, the amount of oxygen available decreases. If you were in Denver, you'd see that you would only have 84% of the oxygen that you have here. So if any of you are football fans, you know that the Broncos dominate in the second half because all the visiting teams from low-lying areas are pooped out by that point because they don't have the adaptations to derive enough oxygen. If we go up to La Paz and Lhasa, which are at these very high elevations, over 4,500 meters, we see that the oxygen levels are down less than 2/3 of what they are at sea level. So we're talking about severe challenges, and we're going to see a lot of really big adaptations there. Now I'm going to ignore this higher part because there aren't any permanent residences there. We just go and visit these high elevations with their 1/3 of the oxygen to prove that we can. If you look at physiological responses to hypoxia, which is the term for low oxygen, you see that they can vary from minutes to a few months or days, and we would call this acclimatization. It's a reversible process. Most people can do it. If you are born at high altitude, you may be able to use some of that physiology, but you might also be able to have some developmental stimulus. By growing at hypoxia, you might have differential development, and that could help you be better as an adult. But of course, if the populations are going to live there for generation after generation, there's going to be some sort of an evolutionary pressure and selection so that we see our genetic advances in these populations that have lived at high altitude for a long time. So there are three different populations that have independently evolved at these high altitudes, and they all have different approaches from the suite of physiology and genetic combinations that allow them to live at these areas. So if we look at the Andeans, and these were the first that were probably studied, we know that the Andeans have had a very long history at high altitude because we can see their extensive civilizations that were there long ago. These are the ancestors of the people that still live in these areas. And so they've been in these areas for a long time and accumulated a lot of adaptations. Some of those include they have a high hemoglobin concentration. That's the protein in your blood that carries the oxygen around. They have very large chest and lung volume compared to their body size. And combined, these give them an extremely high capacity for oxygen consumption and for exercise, even when the oxygen in the surroundings is really low. So there's famously the Incan runners that could run from mountaintop to mountaintop because they had these enormous chests. If you look at this development and compare high altitude children with low altitude children, so here the solid line would be children that are developing at high altitude versus the low altitude. At every single age until they reach maturity, their stature or the height is lower in these high altitude children. However, if you look at their lung size, you would see that the high altitude children at every single age have a much larger lung capacity than their low altitude age matched children. So is it genetics? Is it development? Or is it some combination of the two of these? So here we're representing the thorax. This is the part of the chest that's going to allow them to inhale more of this atmosphere. And then here we're looking at their specific ventilation rates. And so that's going to be a measure of how efficient are they. If you look at this gray line, is the competency of Bostonians at sea level. And so in this particular study, they determined that those would be, they both have evolved at low altitude and they're living at low altitude. And they have the poorest performance. If you look at the Andeans that have evolved at high altitude and are currently living at high altitude, they have by far, that green line, the highest performance of all of the groups. Okay, so it could be genetics, could be development. How would you break these two apart? Well, you could move the people around. Now, they didn't do this in the study. They just followed people that had done this for whatever reason. And so if you look at the red line, these would be people who have the ethnic background to have been evolved in the highlands, but they've migrated to sea level as children. So they would not have that developmental stimulus that would give them the high lungs, but they do have the genetics. And you see that they have about the same performance as people that are born at sea level but come from Andean parents. So there's a combination of both of these. Today, people are going out because you have these high throughput genetics things that you can do where you can run lots and lots and lots of sequences at relatively low and fast levels. And so people are looking for genes that might be associated with some of these adaptations. So one of these is a variant, which is a SNP, a single nucleotide polymorphism. So just basically one letter in the DNA is different. So there's a T and a C version of these. And for the Andeans, over 3/4 of them have at least one copy of this T variety. And you can see over on the left that it gives them a huge boost in being able to have a higher oxygen consumption. So the more copies of this gene you have, the better off. So this is just one example of those genes. Now, the Tibetans are famous for their ability to perform at high altitude. Of course, they are the guides that take all of those Europeans who are not adapted to high altitude up in the Himalayas, and sometimes even without any extra oxygen. So they're very well adapted to this area. And we'll be talking about their adaptations. They have a lower hemoglobin concentration than the Andeans, but they have really efficient delivery of oxygen at the tissue level, probably because their capillaries actually make their own nitrous oxide. And this causes the capillaries to expand in diameter and then offload more oxygen. So it probably contributes to their efficiency. And then there's also various genes that have been associated with performance for the Tibetans. If we go to Ethiopia, there are a couple of different ethnic groups that live at high altitude, but there's been very few studies. So I don't have much to say about them. If we look at the hemoglobin of females that live at high altitude and sort of focus on around 4,000 meters, the red dots are the amount of hemoglobin that Andeans have. And so this is a really high amount of hemoglobin. The blue triangles are the amount of hemoglobin in 100 milliliters of blood that the Tibetans have. Again, a high amount, but not as high as the Andeans, but far more than the lowlanders, which are the black triangles. If we look at the Ethiopians, there's really not a clear pattern. And I preface this by saying there are very few people involved in the studies that I'll show you. So the gray dots are people from the Amhara group, and they seem to mostly be falling within the Tibetans, except for this person who was more like a lowlander. And then they have one subset from the Oromo people, and they fall a little bit more with the Andeans. So it's not really clear how they're acclimating to the high altitude, but it's not the same as either one of the other groups. Well, if you want to think about this long-term living at high altitude, you've got to think about evolutionary changes, and those center around reproductive fitness. So if you can't leave more children than your neighbors, then you are not going to succeed in this environment. So, and you may have noticed that all of my pictures of the people that live at high altitude are women and children. And so we're going to be focusing on that maternal fetal health and see how that fits in with their success rate at the top. So I also have sex in here. So biologists are just obsessed with it. So if you think about oxygen transport to the fetus, you've got whatever oxygen there is in the atmosphere. It has to be breathed into the lungs. From the lungs, it has to diffuse across the membranes of the lungs and the blood cells and get into the hemoglobin. So you've got lots of barriers. And then the blood is moved around through the body, and then the hemoglobin has to offload that oxygen across another set of tissues to the site of the cells where it's going to be used. Well, if you're talking about a pregnant woman and the fetus, there's even more layers where you have to transfer. So here we would see that you would have the placenta, so the uterine artery would deliver that blood. The oxygen would have to diffuse from the hemoglobin across the tissues onto the hemoglobin of the fetus. And so that hemoglobin has to be adapted to take up oxygen at really low concentrations. And then, of course, it goes and is used by the tissues of the fetus in order to develop and then ultimately determine the birth weight of the offspring. So they're really well adapted, but again, you're starting out with a lot lower oxygen to begin with, and so there's going to be a lot less oxygen available to that fetus. Now, if we look at the adaptive challenges of having low oxygen, you can look at it across the entire life, from conception to death. We're going to be focused on those earlier phases because that's where most natural selection is acting. And so if we think about early on in development, having low oxygen present can give you a lot of congenital abnormalities. This can cause a failure to thrive. As you move along, you can have preeclampsia, which is a condition with high blood pressure in the mother. It causes early birth, preterm birth, and it can also cause maternal mortality. So this is a big problem. If you give birth early, you're going to have a smaller baby. And if you have a smaller baby, it's much more likely to have complications once it's born and not to survive. And then it's also much more likely that it's going to grow slowly as an adolescent. So all of these factors are really important. Now, you don't have to be a scientist or a geneticist to recognize these differences between people that have evolved at high altitude and recent visitors. So a 16th century missionary was quoted as saying, he was a missionary in the Andes, "The Indians are healthiest and where they multiply the most prolifically is in these same cold air tempers. Yet most children of the Spaniards, when born in such regions, do not survive. Now, ultimately, we found that there were some Spaniards that came there and had offspring that survived, and we have Europeans living in many of these areas. However, if we look at birth weights, we can see the difference between long evolved and adapted groups and more recent immigrants. Now, overall, if you're living at high altitude, you're going to have a smaller baby. So there's just less oxygen available, so it's very likely that they're going to develop and be smaller at birth. However, the uterine blood flow is dramatically elevated in Tibetans compared to the Han Chinese, who are the recent immigrants to Tibet. And so if you look at around 4,000 meters, you can see that babies that are born there, maybe on average are over 3,200 grams compared to less than 2,800 grams for the Han Chinese babies. Now, even if you don't know what grams are with a relative sort of field, that is a huge decrease in the birth weight. And the same thing goes for the Andeans. You see that Andeans have better blood flow to the uterus and to the placenta, and therefore the fetuses are going to be getting more oxygen, and they're going to develop better as well. Now, again, with our genetic studies, we're able to look for some of these variant genes that have been selected. So there's been positive selection. Women with these characteristics are more likely to give birth to successful children. So one of these gene variants that has been discovered is one that affects the ability of the hemoglobin to be saturated with oxygen at high altitude. So one of them is a low oxygen saturation, one form is a high oxygen saturation, or you can have two of the same thing, or you can have one of each. And it turns out that the high saturation one, luckily for Tibetans, is dominant. And so if we look at women with any of these combinations of the alleles, they have pretty much the same number of pregnancies and the number of live births. So on that side of the equation, it doesn't seem to make as much of a difference. However, if we look at other things that are very important, we see that the number of infant deaths is enormously increased if you have two copies of this low oxygen saturation gene. And if you have two copies of that gene, not only do you have a larger number of infant deaths, but over the course of your lifespan, you don't have as many living children. So it's half. And so that is going to be a very strong selection pressure to eliminate that gene, or at least to reduce it in the population. So we've seen several different ways that you can be successful at high altitude. The Andeans, the Tibetans, I hope someday there will be more studies so we can say more about the Ethiopians. But again, we have all of these populations that are thriving. And so humans can make it up there, and they can actually set up communities and live in these areas. Thank you.
All right, I think I missed the memo on having sex. But I will tell you that typical lowlanders at very high elevation, sex is definitely the last thing. So what I want to tell you about today, so first, in an introduction, you're saying, what is a molecular geneticist doing talking about physiology? Well, I did start my scientific life as some kind of a physiologist, so neurophysiologist, but had some experience there. So I'm going to tell you about a little more about visiting high altitude and what, things like this, what we do there, and consider the question if whether that mountaintop experience has anything to do with lack of oxygen.
What do you got to say to the folks? All right, squad.
This is hard, man.
Pretend like you like each other.
This is hard. Think twice before you do this, because this is hard.
Talking to his mom.
So I guess Rafi was having a difficult time at that elevation. So why is this hard? Well, one possibility, sometimes it's hard because of what you're doing. In the case of climbing this mountain, Mount Shasta, the average grade on this part of the climb is 35% grade, so that's about 1,500 feet per mile. But there's one other serious reason that this is a lot harder than it would be otherwise, and that's because of the reduced oxygen availability. And so starting this hike at 8,000 feet, you've got about 75% of the oxygen. And by the time you get to the summit at over 14,000 feet, you only have about 59% of the oxygen available that you would have at sea level. So we're not used to this. This is not something that we should, necessarily be doing. So as opposed to what Sue was telling you about, 95% of us live below 1,000 meters, okay? And in fact, more than a third of us live within 100 meters of sea level. So, and of course we know there are other particularly future issues about that, okay? But, so as a species generally, notwithstanding what Sue told you, we are lowlanders, okay? We are not used to going to those higher elevations. Of course, as she told you, some humans do live at higher altitudes, and some humans visit higher altitudes to, maybe have some fun. Type 2 fun, they call it sometimes, in case you've heard of that idea. So, let's think about altitude. So there are various ways that people classify altitude, and this is actually related to thinking about how we respond to it. So, again, we said 95% of us live below 1,000 meters, so we get intermediate altitude, 1,500 to 2,500. We've kept all the feet there as well because most of us think in feet, myself included. So when we're talking about elevations, high altitude, very high altitude, extreme altitude, and then the death zone, or if you want something less dramatic, ultra-high altitude. Okay? So, let's think about, okay, so where are we talking about? Let's pick out, among my favorite things, mountains, okay, is peaks. So, local peak, third highest peak in Southern California, Mount San Jacinto, about 10,000 feet. So, it's in high end of the high altitude range, okay? These, I've put, again, some of, ones that you might be familiar with. These are the 3 highest peaks in Southern California. Here's the highest peak in, we call Europe, okay, as in Russia, the Caucasus Mountains, okay. Extreme altitude, we start getting, so these are all the highest peaks in Africa, in North America, and in South America, or the entire Western Hemisphere, Aconcagua. And of course, the familiar ones in the so-called death zone. These are all 14 peaks above here are all in the Himalayas. So you won't find the death zone anywhere else. Although occasionally when you're up there, you sort of feel that way. All right. So, generally speaking, people may visit, but they don't tend to live at extreme altitudes. And so let's look at a few cities. So Mammoth Lakes, right? So go skiing. Vail's at about 8,000 feet, if we're talking feet. So some of those Andean cities, some of the place where the Europeans are having a hard time, okay? Very high altitude now. We get into Tibet. Here's some more in the Andes, okay? Oh, by the way, people, as you hear about Machu Picchu, you see the pictures, everyone says, oh my gosh, it's so high when you go to Machu Picchu, okay? So Machu Picchu is about as high as Vail. If you go visit Machu Picchu, you'll probably fly into Cuzco. So hang out at Cuzco for a while. Machu Picchu is going to be a breeze, okay? So, all right. Now, nobody lives at extreme elevation permanently, okay? Everest summit, about 33% of available oxygen at sea level. So That's, difficult. Now, the highest permanent settlement that you can find is in the Andes, called La Rinconada in Peru. That's at 16,700 feet. That's not a good place to live, okay? It has about 50% of the oxygen at sea level. Now, of course, the population of 30,000, which varies actually quite a bit from time to time, is mainly those indigenous people who evolved at this elevation. Why do people live up there? There's gold, okay? It's actually a horrible place where there are no legal gold mines, but there's gold and people attempt to harvest it. So, all right. Now, what happens when we go to high altitude? So I'm going to just read from the literature here. Lowland residents rapidly ascending to high and especially very high or extreme altitudes are at risk of developing high altitude illness and experiencing substantial impairment of their physical and cognitive work performance. Okay, that sounds sort of grim. All right, well, let's do an experiment here. Let's see if we can achieve acute mountain sickness, also, often abbreviated AMS, via rapid ascent. So we're going to take a group of people and from sea level, and in one day we're going to take them to the top of Pikes Peak, which is above 14,000 feet. And so let's look at the incidence of acute mountain sickness here. You can see that on day one, over 80% of the people, 8 in 10 people are sick, and personally, I don't believe the other 2 who say they're not. Okay? All right. So, well, what is AMS? Okay, so if you've ever been there, symptoms include headache. That's like probably most everyone gets a little bit of headache, even when things are really good. Nausea, up to and including vomiting. Okay, loss of appetite, fatigue, malaise, sleep. Your sleep getting messed up, dizziness, lightheadedness. Lightheadedness sounds about right, with little oxygen. So, and this can progress. So this, is over a huge range of levels of symptoms, right? From mild headache, mild nausea, to then getting really severe. So there are severe versions of advanced acute mountain sickness that can be deadly, such as HAPE, high-altitude pulmonary edema, and HACE, high-altitude cerebral edema. Not good things. Now, on the other hand, curing this, to some degree, is really easy if there's either you can do it or someone can help you do it, and the cure is descent, okay? So basically, when you run into this, so if you've ever watched any of these programs with people climbing or all those crazy people trying to climb Everest, they're saying, I'm sorry, you're going to have to go down. They're going, no, but I paid $100,000, so, but these are real things. I have personally been with someone who is experiencing maybe both of these, okay, but definitely one of them, and this is very similar to like hypothermia. Looks actually is hard to tell apart to some degree without a brain scan or something. So, which we don't seem to have in the mountains usually. So, well, let's talk about acclimatization. So, in fact, what you're seeing in this graph actually is acclimatization. So, after one day where everyone was feeling bad, pretty soon, within a week, most of them are not showing acute mountain sickness. So what's going on here? So now let's look for a moment at one of the things where we can see this going on. So let's test these people for exercise ability and look at their heart rate. So heart rate's over here now. And so again, early exercise where their heart might be around 110 beats per minute, same level of exercise, you're now at over 150 beats per minute. And over this same time course, you can see that it's coming down quite a bit, but not entirely, right? So we're still need more time than to really get back to normal. So why is this happening? Well, so one of the problems we have is we are not saturating our hemoglobin with oxygen. So there's a resting O2 saturation, or as they just say, O2 sats, right? And here's, exercise, even worse. But you can, once again, see a fair bit of improvement in the short term, although we're still down here. Now, down here, as lowlanders, if your oxygen saturation is below 90 to 92%, they think we're going to send you to the emergency room, okay, because you have pneumonia, you have severe COVID, you have, what else? You have a pulmonary edema, you have pulmonary embolism, you have congestive heart failure. But when we go up into the mountains, that oxygen saturation is entirely normal, okay? We might be at 80%, where down here you'd be in big trouble, okay, if you had that. So, all right. Now, little piece of good news. This probably has something to do with, and I don't know the actual test they did for this, something to do with being human and having a smart brain, okay? Your cognitive performance can come back pretty quickly. So you're probably saying, okay, you're getting over the fact that my brain hurts a little bit. And, okay, I'm still going to do that test, okay, and do okay. All right. Now, let's think about acclimatization. So what is it? So it is a complex, multi-part process, okay? One thing to think about is, so if you're ever thinking of going into the mountains and say, for example, even say, very popular mountain in Southern California, Mount Baldy, okay, pretty high. You can just drive up to it and bang, just start, drive from Venice, okay, go up and just bang, start climbing the mountain. Even 15 minutes, okay, good idea. If you can take longer, take your time, okay? Every little bit helps because we have things that happen within minutes, okay? So there are changes. For example, your heart rate goes up, okay? You get a bit more cardiac output. Your breathing rate goes up, aka hyperventilation. That can be a normal response to this situation, okay? Now, there are all kinds of changes that can occur. They take, minutes, days, weeks, even months, and of course, generations if you want, evolutionary adaptation. So, now, one of the things that a lot of us who go to mountains think about is how long does this acclimatization last? So if I get some acclimatization and then want to go back again, how long is it going to last? Well, actually, the answers are really, it's hard to find a good answer in the literature. And in fact, it's very similar to the acclimatization gain, which is their short-term, medium, long-term kinds of things. Let's talk about one long-term good thing with acclimatization. So if you've done enough acclimatization that your body has said, buddy, you need some more red blood cells. And so your body has pumped out a little extra erythropoietin, so you're making more red blood cells. Well, the good news is that the half-life of a typical red blood cell is about 120 days. So if you've managed to make more red blood cells, that's going to last a while, all right? Okay, so of course, if we start talking to the real serious physiologists here, there's a lot going on here. So here we're looking, minutes, days, months, sort of a log scale here on the x-axis. And so you can see, we're getting more cerebral blood flow, hyperventilation, pulmonary artery pressure is changing, cardiac output. It's looking like as we get some other adaptations, some other things are going down because we're acclimatizing, okay? So we're getting all kinds of cardiac changes. here's our erythropoiesis, so making more new red blood cells. Actually, your muscles will actually develop new capillaries, okay, so you can deliver more oxygen, all right? And, of course, the hemoglobin concentration goes up. So lots of different, higher number of red blood cells. So lots of really interesting, complex things going on, short-term, medium, and long-term. So, now one of the things about acclimatization is it doesn't require being at low pressure. I mean, the reason that we have less oxygen, we still have 20% oxygen on top of Everest, it's just that the pressure is so much lower that there's literally less oxygen there. So, but getting acclimatization is mostly about reduced oxygen availability. You don't need low pressure, okay? So, you can do things like, okay, we can simulate high altitude merely by being exposed to low oxygen at what for us lowlanders we call normal pressure, okay? So there's something you can do, it's called intermediate hypoxic breathing, where periodically you're wearing a mask and you get hit with really low oxygen, okay? And so you can do that on a bike, you can do it with exercise, you can just sit in a chair and do it. So you can get one of these machines. Don't you love the name here? So it's an altitude generator or a hypoxicator, okay? Things about this big, okay? Heavy, 50 pounds, okay, this one. Or you can get an altitude tent and sleep in low oxygen. So, there we are. That guy is there. So, you can sleep at low oxygen. Now, so what I'm going to tell you, though, then, is, so the mountaintop experience, it's not low oxygen. In fact, low oxygen and not being acclimatized is unpleasant, okay? So, mountaintops, on the other hand, are alluring, beautiful, and to be there, exhilarating when you're properly acclimatized, okay? So, go slowly, take your time, maybe rent a tent, okay? And as they say in Kiswahili, go pole pole, which means slowly, slowly. All right. Thank you.